Book 2, Chapters 1 through 15 of Commentaries on the Gallic War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar, translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book 2, Chapter 1. The first campaign against the Belgae. While Caesar, as we have mentioned above, was wintering in Cisalpine Gaul, frequent rumors reached him, which were confirmed by dispatches from Labienus, that the Belgae, whose territory, as we have remarked, forms a third part of Gaul, were all conspiring against the Roman people and exchanging hostages. The motives of the conspiracy, it appeared, were these. First, the Belgae were afraid that, as the whole of Gaul was tranquilized, our army might advance against them. Secondly, they were egged on by sundry Gauls, some of whom, just as they had objected to the continuing presence of the Germans in Gaul, were irritated by the Roman army wintering in the country and settling there, while others, from instability and fickleness of temperament, hankered after a change of masters, and also by powerful individuals, especially those who had the means of hiring mercenaries, who, as often happened in Gaul, had been wont to usurp royal authority, and found it less easy to achieve this end under our dominion. Alarmed by these messages and dispatches, Caesar raised 2 new legions in Cisalpine Gaul, and directed Quintus Pedius, one of his generals, to lead them, at the beginning of the fine weather, into further Gaul. As soon as forage began to be plentiful, he joined the army in person, and charged the Senones and the other Gauls who were conterminous with the Belgae to find out what was going on in their country and to keep him informed. They all agreed in reporting that levies were being raised and that an army was concentrating. Caesar now thought it his duty to march against them without hesitation. After arranging for a supply of grain, he broke up his camp and reached the Belgic frontier in about a fortnight. He arrived unexpectedly and sooner than anyone had anticipated. The Remi, the nearest of the Belgae to Gaul, sent Iccius and Andecumborius, the leading men of the tribe, as envoys, to say that they would place their lives and all that they possessed under the protection and at the disposal of the Roman people, that they had not shared the counsels of the other Belgae, or joined the conspiracy against the Roman people, and that they were prepared to give hostages and to obey orders, to admit the Romans into their strongholds, and to supply them with corn and other necessaries. That all the other Belgae were in arms, and that the Germans who dwelt on the near side of the Rhine had joined them, and that they were all possessed by such frenzy that the Remi could not deter even the Suessiones, their own kith and kin, who had the same rights and laws as themselves, and jointly owned the authority of one and the same magistrate, from taking their side. On inquiring from the envoys the names of the belligerent tribes, their size, and their military strength, Caesar collected the following information. Most of the Belgae were of German origin, and had crossed the Rhine at a remote period, and settled in Gaul on account of the fertility of the land. They had driven out the Gallic inhabitants, and were the only people who, at the time within the memory of our fathers, when the whole of Gaul was devastated, prevented the Teutoni and the Cimbri from invading their country. Inspired by the memory of that achievement, they arrogated to themselves great authority and assumed the air of a great military power. With regard to their numbers, the Remi professed to have full information, for, being allied to them by blood and intermarriage, they had ascertained the strength of the contingent which each tribe had promised in the general council of the Belgae for the impending war. The Bellovaci, who from their valor, prestige, and numbers were the most powerful of all, and could muster 100,000 armed men, had promised 60,000 picked troops, and claimed the general direction of the campaign. The Suessiones were their own neighbours, and their territory was very extensive and very fertile. Within the memory of men still living, their king had been Diviciacus, the most powerful prince in the whole of Gaul, who was overlord not only of a large part of the Belgic territory, but also of Britain. The reigning king was Galba, who, on account of his integrity and sound judgment, was unanimously entrusted with the chief command. The Suessiones possessed 12 strongholds, and promised 50,000 armed men. The same number was promised by the Nervii, who were considered by the Belgae themselves as the fiercest of them all, and who were the most remote. The Atrebates promised 15,000. The Ambiani 10,000. The Menapii 7,000. The Caleti 10,000. The Veliocases and the Viromandui jointly the same number, and the Aduatuci 19,000. The Condrusi, the Eburones, the Cairoisi, and the Paimani, who were known by the common appellation of Germans, promised, so the Remi believed, about 40,000. Caesar addressed the Remi in encouraging and in gracious terms, and ordered their entire council to meet him, and the children of the leading men to be brought to him as hostages. All these orders they carefully and punctually obeyed. He then earnestly impressed upon the Aeduan Diviciacus that it was most important in the interest of the Republic, and indeed of the Aeduans and Romans alike, to break up the enemy's forces, so as to avoid the necessity of engaging such a powerful host at once. The object could be attained if the Aedui marched into the country of the Bellovaci and proceeded to devastate their lands. With this injunction he dismissed Diviciacus. Finding that all the Belgic forces had concentrated and were marching against him, and learning from the reconnoitering parties which he had sent out, and from the Remi, that they were not far off, he pushed on rapidly, crossed the Aisne, which flows through the most distant part of the country of the Remi, and encamped near its banks. This movement protected one side of his camp by the banks of the river, secured his rear, and enabled his supplies to be brought up without danger by the Remi and the other tribes. The river was spanned by a bridge, at the head of which he established a strong post, while on the other side of the river he left 6 cohorts under one of his generals, Titurius Sabinus. At the same time he ordered a camp to be constructed, with a rampart 12 feet high and a trench 18 feet wide. 8 miles from the camp there was a town belonging to the Remi called Bibrax. The Belgae attacked it furiously on their march, and the garrison had difficulty in holding out that day. The following method of attacking forts is practiced by Gauls and Belgae alike. Surrounding the whole circuit of the fortifications with a multitude of men, they proceeded to hurl stones from all sides against the wall, and when they have cleared it, they lock their shields over their heads, and advance right up to the gates and undermine the wall. In this case the operation was easily performed, for, with such a huge host hurling stones and other missiles, no man had a chance of keeping his footing on the wall. When night stopped the attack, Iccius, a Reman of the highest rank and very popular with his countrymen, who was acting as governor of the town, one of the envoys who had come to Caesar to sue for peace, sent him word that, unless a force were sent to his relief, he could hold out no longer. About midnight, Caesar, employing as guides the messengers who had come from Iccius, sent his Numidian and Cretan archers and Balearic slingers to Bibrax to relieve the inhabitants. On their arrival, the Remi, inspired by the hope of repelling the attack, became eager to take the offensive, and for the same reason the enemy abandoned the hope of taking the town. Accordingly, after lingering a short time in the neighbourhood, ravaging the lands of the Remi, and burning all of the villages and homesteads within reach, they pushed on with all their forces towards Caesar's camp, and encamped barely 2 miles off. Judging by the smoke and watchfires, their camp extended more than 8 miles in width. Caesar determined, in the first instance, to avoid an action, on account of the great numbers of the enemy, and of their extraordinary reputation for valour. Still, he daily tested in cavalry skirmishes the mettle of the enemy and the daring of our troops, and found that the latter were a match for them. The ground in front of his camp was naturally just suited for forming a line of battle. The hill on which the camp stood, rising gradually from the plain, extended, facing the enemy, over the exact space which the line would occupy. On either flank its sides descended abruptly, while in front it gradually merged in the plain by a gentle slope. On either side of the hill, Caesar drew a trench athwart, about 800 paces long, and at the end of each trench erected a redoubt, in which he posted artillery to prevent the enemy when he had formed his line, from taking advantage of their great numerical superiority to attack his men in flank and surround them. Having done this, he left his 2 newly raised legions in camp, so that they might be available at any point as a reserve, and drew up the remaining 6 in line of battle in front of the camp. The enemy likewise had marched their forces out of the camp and formed them in line. There was a morass of no great size between our army and that of the enemy. The enemy waited to see whether our men would cross it, while our men, weapons in hand, were ready to attack them in case they crossed first, when their movements would be impeded. Meanwhile, a skirmish of horse was going on between the 2 lines. Neither side would cross first, and the skirmish resulting in favor of our men, Caesar withdrew his infantry into the camp. Forthwith the enemy moved rapidly from their position to gain the river Aisne, which, as the narrative has shown, was in the rear of our camp. There they discovered a ford, and endeavoured to throw a part of their force across, intending, if possible, to storm the redoubt commanded by the general, Quintus Titurius, and break down the bridge, or, failing this, to devastate the lands of the Remi, who were very useful to us in the campaign, and to cut off our troops from supplies. Caesar, on receiving information from Titurius, took the whole of his cavalry, his light-armed Numidians, slingers, and archers, across the bridge, and pushed on rapidly against them. A fierce combat took place at the spot where they were crossing. Our men attacked the enemy in the river, while their movements were impeded, and killed a great number of them. The rest made a most daring attempt to get across over their dead bodies, but they were beaten back by a shower of missiles, while the leading division, who had crossed already, were surrounded by the cavalry and killed. The enemy realized that they had deceived themselves in expecting to storm the stronghold and cross the river. They saw that the Romans would not advance and fight on an unfavorable position, and their supply of grain was beginning to run short. They therefore called a council of war, and decided that the best course would be for the several contingents to return home, and rally from all parts to the defence of the people, whose country the Roman army invaded first. They would thus fight in their own and not in foreign territory, and have the benefit of homegrown supplies. Among other reasons, they were led to adopt this resolution by the knowledge that Diviciacus and the Aedui were approaching the country of the Bellovaci, and the latter could not be induced to remain any longer and refrain from helping their own people. Having come to this decision, they moved out of camp in the second watch with great uproar and confusion. There was no order, no discipline, everybody trying to get the first place on the road, and being in a hurry to reach home, so that their departure resembled a rout. Caesar was promptly informed of what they had done by scouts. Fearing an ambuscade, for he did not yet clearly see the reason for their departure, he kept his army, including the cavalry, in camp. At daybreak the report was confirmed by patrols, and Caesar sent on ahead the whole of his cavalry, commanded by 2 generals, Quintus Pedius and Lucius Aurunculeius Cotta, to retard the rear guard, at the same time ordering Titus Labienus to follow in support with 3 legions. This force attacked the rear guard and pursued them for many miles, killing a large number of the fugitives. For while the rearmost ranks, when overtaken, made a stand, and gallantly resisted the attack of our infantry, the van, fancying themselves out of reach of danger, and not being restrained by necessity or discipline, broke their ranks when they heard the distant cries and ran for their lives. Thus our men slaughtered them in numbers, without any risk to themselves, as long as daylight lasted. Towards sunset they left off, and returned in obedience to instructions to camp. On the following day, before the enemy could recover from their panic flight, Caesar led the army into the country of the Suessiones, who were conterminous with the Remi, and pushed on by a forced march to the stronghold of Noviodunum. Hearing that it was undefended, he attempted, immediately after his arrival, to storm it, but the moat was so broad and the wall so high that, notwithstanding the small number of the garrison, he was unable to carry the position. After entrenching his camp, he proceeded to form a line of sheds, and to make the necessary preparations for a siege. On the following night, before he could resume operations, the whole host of the fugitive Suessiones thronged into the town. The sheds were speedily brought up. earth was shot into the moat, and towers were erected, and the Gauls, alarmed by the magnitude of the works, which they had never seen or even heard of before, and also by the swift energy of the Romans, sent envoys to Caesar proposing to surrender. The Remi interceded for their lives, and their prayer was granted. Caesar took the leading men of the tribe, as well as 2 of King Galba's own sons, as hostages, and after all the arms in the town had been delivered up, he accepted the surrender of the Suessiones, and marched into the country of the Bellovaci, who threw themselves with all their belongings into the stronghold of Bratus Pantium. When Caesar and his army were about 5 miles off, the older men all came out, stretched out their hands to him, and declared that they were ready to place themselves under his protection and in his power, and that they were not in arms against the Roman people. In like manner, when he had approached the stronghold and was encamping on its outskirts, the women and children stretched out their hands from the wall in the native fashion and begged the Romans for peace. Diviciacus, who, after the retreat of the Belgae, had disbanded the Aeduan forces and returned to Caesar, interceded for the suppliants. The Bellovaci, he said, had at all times been dependents on the Aedui, and in amicable relations with them, but at the instigation of their leaders, who said that the Aedui had been enslaved by Caesar, and had to put up with ill usage and insults of every kind, they had abandoned their connection with them, and taken up arms against the Roman people. The ringleaders, realizing the magnitude of the disaster which they had brought upon their country, had escaped to Britain. Not only the Bellovaci, but also the Aedui on their behalf, would beg Caesar to treat them with the forbearance and humanity for which he was distinguished. By doing so he would increase the authority of the Aedui among the Belgae generally, for the Aedui commonly relied on their assistance and resources to carry on any wars in which they happened to be engaged. Caesar said he would spare their lives and take them under his protection out of respect for Diviciacus and the Aedui. But as the tribe ranked high among the Belgae and had a very large population, he required 600 hostages. After they had delivered over and all the arms brought out of the town and piled, Caesar marched from Bratus Pantium to the territory of the Ambiani, who surrendered unreservedly without delay. Their territory was conterminous with that of the Nervii. Caesar made inquiries about the character, manners, and customs of this people, and collected the following information. Traders were not allowed to enter their country. They would not permit the importation of anything in the shape of wine or other luxuries, believing that courage was enfeebled by these indulgences, and manly vigor enervated. They were a fierce, brave people, and railing at the other Belgae and accusing them of having surrendered to the Romans and made shipwreck of their ancestral valor, they vowed that they would not send envoys or accept peace on any terms. End of Book 2, chapters 1 through 15. Book 2, chapters 16 through 35 of Commentaries on the Gallic War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar, translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book 2, chapters 16 through 35. After marching for 3 days through their territory, Caesar learned from prisoners that the Nervii had encamped on the further side of the river called the Sambre, which was not more than 10 miles from his camp, and were there awaiting the arrival of the Romans, along with their neighbours the Atrebates and the Viromandui, both of whom they had persuaded to share with them the fortune of war. They were waiting for the force of the Aduatuci, which was marching to join them, and they had hastily transferred their women, and all who were disqualified by age for fighting, to a spot which was rendered inaccessible for an army by marshes. On learning this, Caesar sent on ahead a reconnoitering party and centurions to choose a good position for a camp. A considerable number of the Belgae who had surrendered and other Gauls had followed him and were marching in his train. Some of them, as was afterwards ascertained from prisoners, having observed the order in which our army marched during the first 3 days, made their way to the Nervii in the night, and explained to them that each legion was followed by a great quantity of baggage, and that when the foremost legion reached camp and the rest were a long way off, there would be no difficulty in attacking it while the men were burdened with their packs. When it was beaten and its baggage plundered, the rest would not venture to make a stand. One circumstance favored the plan recommended by the men who gave this information. In times past, the Nervii, having no cavalry, to this day they pay no attention to that arm, their whole strength being in infantry, devised the following method of checking their neighbours' cavalry when they made plundering raids into their territory. Lopping off the tops of young saplings and bending them over so that their branches shot out thickly sideways, they planted brambles and briars between, the hedges thus formed making a barrier like a wall, which made it impossible not only to penetrate but even to see through. As the march of our column was delayed by these obstacles, the Nervii felt that the preferred advice was worth following. The lie of the ground which our men had selected for their camp may be thus described. A hill sloped evenly down from its summit to the river Sambre already mentioned. From the river there arose a second hill of the same gradient, opposite the other, and directly facing it. The ground was open at the lower end for about 400 paces, but wooded higher up, so that it was not easy to see through. The enemy were in ambush within the woods, while on the open ground along the river a few cavalry piquets were visible. The depth of the river was about 3 feet high. Caesar had sent on his cavalry in advance, and was following with all his forces, but the column was formed on a different principle, from which the Belgae had described to the Nervii. 6 of Caesar's legions, according to his usual practice when he was approaching an enemy, were advancing in light marching order. Behind them was the baggage train of the entire army, followed by the 2 newly raised legions, which closed the rear and protected the baggage. Our cavalry, along with the slingers and archers, crossed the river and engaged the enemy's horse. The latter fell back repeatedly into the woods on support of their comrades, and again emerging, charged our men, who dared not pursue them, when they retreated beyond the fringe of the open ground. Meanwhile, the 6 legions which had come up first proceeded to entrench the camp along the lines which had been marked out. When the head of our baggage train was descried by the troops ambushed in the woods, the moment which they had agreed upon for the beginning of the battle, suddenly, in the exact order in which, with mutual exhortations, they formed their line within, the whole force darted forth and swooped down upon our cavalry. Sending them flying in disorder, without any effort, they rushed down to the stream with such incredible swiftness that it seemed as if almost at the same instant they were at the woods, in the river, and now at sword's point with our men. As swiftly they pressed up the hill to attack our camp, and the men who were engaged in entrenching it. Caesar had to arrange everything at once, display the red flag, the signal for arming, sound the trumpet, recall the men from the trenches, send for those who had gone further afield in search of wood, form the line, harangue the troops, and give the signal for battle. Want of time and the enemy's onset prevented much of this from being done. 2 things, however, served to lighten his difficulties. First, the knowledge and experience of the soldiers, who, as seasoned campaigners, were able to decide for themselves what ought to be done as well as others could tell them. And secondly, the fact that he had forbidden his marshals to leave the works and their respective legions till the camp was entrenched. As the enemy were so close and coming up so fast, they did not wait for orders from Caesar, but made the arrangements which they thought right on their own responsibility. Caesar, after giving indispensable orders, hurried down at haphazard to encourage the soldiers, and came to the 10th legion. He spoke briefly, merely urging the men to remember their ancient valor, keep cool, and sustain resolutely the enemy's rush. Then, as the enemy were within range, he gave the signal for action. Going on to another part of the field to encourage the men, he found them already engaged. Time was so short, and the enemy were so ready and eager for battle, that there were not a moment even for putting on helmets and pulling up the covers off shields, much less for fitting on crests. Each man, as he came down from the trenches, fell in by the standard he first caught sight of, wherever he happened to find himself, not wishing to waste the time for action in looking for the men of his company. The army was drawn up as well as time permitted, according to the requirements of the ground, and the slope of the hill, rather than the formation prescribed by tactical rules. The legions were separated and making head against the enemy at different points, while the view was interrupted, as we have explained before, by hedges of extraordinary thickness. It was therefore impossible to post reserves at fixed points, or to foresee what would be wanted at each and every part of the field. Nor could one man give all the necessary orders. With such adverse conditions, then, the vicissitudes of fortune were naturally various. The men of the 9th and 10th legions were posted on the left of the line. With a volley of javelins they drove the Atrebates, the division which they had encountered, who were breathless and tired from their rapid charge and enfeebled by wounds, from the high ground to the river, and when they attempted to cross, pressed them, sword in hand, and killed a great many while their movements were impeded. Crossing themselves without hesitation, and pushing on though the slope was against them, when the enemy rallied they renewed the combat and routed them. Similarly, in another part of the field, 2 legions, the 11th and 8th, which were separated from one another, encountered the Virumandui, drove them from the higher ground, and maintained the combat right on the banks of the river. Nearly the whole camp, however, in front and on the left was exposed, and the 12th legion, and at no great distance the 7th, being posted on the right wing, the whole of the Nervii formed in compact column, and led by Boduonatus, the commander-in-chief, advanced rapidly against the position, and while some of them began to move round the legions on their exposed flank, others made for the summit of the hill on which the camp stood. At the same time our cavalry, and the light armed foot associated with them, who were routed, as I have said, by the enemy's first charge, were retreating to the camp when they came full upon the enemy, and again took to flight in another direction. And the servants, who from the rear gate, situated on the crest of the ridge, had seen our victorious troops cross the river, and had gone out to plunder, looked back, and, seeing the enemy moving about in the camp, precipitately fled. Simultaneously a babel of voices arose from the men who were coming up with the baggage, and they rushed panic-stricken in different directions. A body of horsemen belonging to the Treveri, whose courage is proverbial among the Gauls, had been sent by their tribe as an auxiliary force to join Caesar. Alarmed by all these signs of panic, seeing that our camp was thronged by the enemy, and that the legions were hard-pressed and all but hemmed in, that servants, horsemen, slingers, and Numidians had parted company and scattered, and were flying in all directions, they despaired of our success, hastened homewards, and told their countrymen that the Romans were disastrously defeated, and that the enemy had captured their camp and baggage. Caesar, after haranguing the 10th legion, had gone off to the right wing. He saw that his troops were hard-pressed, and that the men of the 12th legion, their standards closely massed, were crowded together and preventing each other from fighting. All the centurions of the 4th cohort, as well as the standard-bearer, were killed. The standard was lost. Almost all the centurions of the other cohorts were either killed or wounded, including the chief centurion, Publius Sextius Baculus, the bravest of the brave, who was so exhausted by a number of severe wounds that he could no longer keep his feet. The men had lost all dash, and some in the rear ranks had abandoned their posts and were slinking away from the field and getting out of range, while the enemy were coming up in front in an unbroken stream from below, and closed in on both flanks. In short, the situation was critical, and there was no reserve available. Seeing all this, Caesar, who had come up without a shield, took one from a soldier in the rear rank, stepped forward into the front rank, and, addressing the centurions by name, encouraged the men and told them to advance, opening their ranks so that they might be able to use their swords more readily. His coming inspired them with hope and gave them new heart, and as every one, even in his extremest peril, was anxious to do his utmost under the eyes of his general, the enemy's onset was in some measure checked. Noticing that the 7th legion, which stood close by, was likewise hard pressed by the enemy, Caesar told the tribunes to make the legions gradually approach one another, face the enemy on all sides, and advance. This was done, and, as the men now gave each other mutual support, and were not afraid of being taken in rear, they began to offer a more confident resistance, and to fight with more resolution. Meanwhile, the men of the two legions which had brought up the rear and guarded the baggage, having received news of the action, had quickened their pace, and were descried on the brow of the hill by the enemy, and Titus Labienus, who had captured the enemy's camp, and observed from the high ground what was going on in ours, sent the 10th legion to the assistance of our men. Realizing from the flight of the cavalry and servants how matters stood, and seeing that camp, legions, and general were in great peril, they put forth their utmost speed. Their arrival wrought such a complete change that, on our side, even men who had lain down severely wounded leaned on their shields and renewed their fight. The servants, noticing the enemy's alarm, rushed upon them, unarmed against armed, while the cavalry, anxious to wipe out the disgrace of their flight by gallant deeds, outvied the legionaries at every point. But the enemy, even in their despair, displayed such heroic courage that, when their foremost ranks had fallen, the next mounted upon their prostrate comrades, and fought standing on their bodies. And when they too were struck down, and the corpses littered in a heap, the survivors hurled, as from a mound, their missiles against our men, and picked up and flung back their javelins. We are not to think, then, that it was in vain that these gallant men dared to cross a broad river, to climb high banks, and to assail a formidable position. These things, in themselves most difficult, had been made easy by their heroism. The battle was over, and the Nervian people, nay, their very name, was brought to the verge of extinction. On hearing the news, the old people, who, as we have said, had taken refuge, along with the women and children, in tidal creeks and swamps, believing that there was nothing to stop the victors, and no security for the vanquished, sent envoys to Caesar with the consent of all the survivors, and surrendered. And, recounting the calamity which had befallen their country, they affirmed that their council had been reduced from 600 to 3, and the number of men capable of bearing arms from 60,000 to a bare 500. Caesar, wishing to establish his character for mercy towards unfortunate suppliants, was careful to shield them from harm, authorized them to retain possession of their territories and strongholds, and commanded their neighbors to abstain and to make their dependents abstain from maltreating or molesting them. The Aduatuci, whose movements we have already described, were coming with all their forces to the assistance of the Nervii, when, on the announcement of the battle, they turned without halting and went home. Abandoning their other strongholds and fortified posts, they removed all their belongings into one fortress of extraordinary natural strength. All round it presented a line of high rocks and steep declivities, which at one point left a gently sloping approach, not more than 200 feet wide. This place the garrison had fortified with a double wall of great height, upon which, as a further protection, they were laying stones of great weight and sharp-pointed beams. The Aduatuci were descended from the Cimbri and Teutoni, who, on their march for our province and Italy, left the stock and baggage which they were unable to drive or carry with them on this side of the Rhine, with some of their number to look after them, and 6,000 men to protect them. After the fate of their countrymen, this band was for many years harassed by the neighboring peoples, sometimes attacking, at other times repelling attack. At length they made peace, and with the consent of all the other tribes, selected this district as their abode. Immediately after the arrival of our army, the Aduatuci made a series of sorties from the town, and engaged in skirmishes with our troops. Afterwards, however, finding themselves shut in by a rampart 12 feet high and 3 miles in extent, with numerous redoubts, they kept inside the stronghold. A line of sheds was formed, and a terrace constructed, and seeing a tower in the process of erection some way off, they at first jeered and made abusive remarks from the wall at the idea of such a huge machine being erected at such a distance. Did these pygmy Romans, with their feeble hands and puny muscles — the Gauls, as a rule, despise our short stature, contrasting it with their own great height — believe themselves able to mount such a ponderous tower on the wall? When, however, they saw it in motion, and actually approaching the walls. The strange and unwonted spectacle alarmed them, and they sent envoys to Caesar to sue for peace. The envoys, saying that Roman warriors were evidently not left unaided by the gods, since they could propel such towering engines at such a rate, declared themselves ready to surrender unreservedly. One thing only they would beg him not to do, if happily in his mercy and forbearance, of which they heard from other peoples, he decided to spare the Aduatuci, not to deprive them of their arms. Almost all their neighbours were their bitter enemies, and jealous of their prowess, and if they surrendered their arms, they could not defend themselves against them. If they were reduced to the alternative, it would be better for them to suffer any fate at the hands of the Romans, rather than be tortured to death by men among whom they were accustomed to hold sway. To this appeal Caesar replied that he would spare the tribe, not because they deserved mercy, but because it was his wont to be merciful, provided they surrendered before the ram touched the wall. But the question of surrender could not be entertained unless they gave up their arms. He would act as he had acted in the case of the Nervii, and order their neighbours not to molest those who had surrendered to the Roman people. The envoys, after reporting his decision to their principals, professed themselves ready to obey his commands. A great quantity of arms was pitched down from the wall into the trench in front of the town, the heap almost reaching to the top of the wall and of the terrace. And yet, as was afterwards discovered, about 1/3 was concealed and kept in the town. The gates were then thrown open, and on the same day the garrison entered upon the enjoyment of peace. Towards evening Caesar ordered the gates to be shut, and the soldiers to leave the town, for fear the inhabitants should suffer any injury at their hands in the night. They had evidently prearranged a plan, believing that, after the capitulation, our troops would withdraw their piquets, or at any rate be less vigilant in maintaining them, and taking the arms which they had kept back and concealed, as well as shields made of bark or wattle-work, which, being pressed for a time, they had hastily covered with skins, they made a sudden sortie in the third watch, with their whole force at the point where the slope leading up to our entrenchments appeared easiest. The alarm was promptly given, in obedience to orders which Caesar had issued in anticipation, by fire signals, and troops hurried to the point from the nearest redoubts. The enemy's whole hope of safety depended on courage alone, and they fought with the fierce energy which was to be expected from brave men, fighting on a forlorn hope, on unfavourable ground, against opponents who were hurling their missiles from rampart and towers. About 4,000 were killed, and the rest driven back into the town. The next day, as there was no longer any resistance, the gates were burst open, the soldiers were sent in, and Caesar sold by auction, in one lot, all of the booty of war found in the town. The purchasers reported the number of individuals as 53,000. At the same time, Caesar was informed by Publius Crassus, whom he had sent with a single legion to the territories of the Venetii, Venelii, Usismi, Coriosolites, Esuvii, Aulerci, and Rhedones, maritime tribes whose country reaches the ocean, that all of them had been brought completely under the dominion of the Roman people. These operations resulted in the pacification of the whole Gaul, and the natives were so impressed by the story of the campaign which reached them, that the peoples who dwelt beyond the Rhine sent envoys to Caesar, promising to give hostages and fulfill his commands. Being anxious to get to Italy and Illyricum without delay, he ordered the envoys to return to him at the commencement of the following summer. Quartering his legions for the winter in the territories of the Carnutes, Andes, Torone, and other tribes which were near the theatre of the recent campaign, he started for Italy. On the receipt of his dispatches, a thanksgiving service of 15 days was appointed to celebrate his achievements, an honour which had not hitherto fallen to the lot of anyone. End of Book 2, chapters 16 through 35.
All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. To learn more or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar, translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book 3, chapters 1 through 16. Galba's campaign in the Valais, campaigns against the maritime tribes, and the Aquitani. When Caesar was starting for Italy, he sent Servius Galba, with the 12th legion, and a detachment of cavalry to the country belonging to the Nantuates, Veragri, and Siduni, which extends from the frontier of the Allobroges, the Lake of Geneva, and the Rhone to the crest of the Alps, being anxious to open up the route over the Alps, by which traders usually travelled at great risk and with the obligation of paying heavy tolls. Galba was authorized to quarter his legion in the district for the winter if he thought it necessary. After he had gained several victories and taken a number of forts belonging to the tribesmen, they sent envoys to him from all parts, gave hostages, and made peace, whereupon he determined to quarter 2 cohorts in the country of the Nantuates, and to winter with the remaining cohorts of the legion in a village belonging to the Veragri, called Octodurus. The village, which is situated in a valley and adjoined by a plain of moderate extent, is walled in on every side by lofty mountains. It was divided by a stream into 2 parts, one of which he allowed the Gauls to occupy, while he reserved the vacant part for the winter quarters of the cohorts, and fortified the position with a rampart and trench. Several days had been spent in camp, and Galba had ordered grain to be brought in, when suddenly he was informed by his patrols that during the night the Gauls had all quitted the part of the village which he had allotted to them, and that the overhanging mountains were occupied by a numerous host of Siduni and Veragri. Various reasons had led the Gauls to form the sudden resolution of renewing hostilities and overpowering the legion. First, the legion was numerically so weak that they despised it. It had not been at its full strength originally, and 2 cohorts, as well as numerous individuals who had been sent out to get supplies, had been withdrawn. Again, as the Romans had the worst of the ground, while they would themselves hurl their missiles charging down into the valley from the hills, they were confident that their first onslaught would be irresistible. Besides, they resented their children being taken from them as hostages, and they were convinced that the Romans were trying to occupy the commanding points of the Alps, and to annex the district to the neighbouring province, not merely in order to open up communication, but to secure a permanent possession. The work of entrenching the camp was not yet quite completed, and corn and other supplies had not been provided in sufficient quantity, for Galba had concluded that, as the enemy had submitted, and he had received their hostages, there was no reason to fear hostilities. Accordingly, on receiving the news, he promptly called a council of war and invited opinions. Great peril had befallen suddenly and unexpectedly. Already, indeed, almost all the heights were seen to be swarming with armed men. The roads were blocked, and therefore it was impossible for relief to arrive or for supplies to be brought up, and safety was deemed all but hopeless. Some, therefore, expressed the opinion that they ought to abandon the baggage, make a sortie, and try to reach a place of safety by the same route by which they had come. The majority, however, decided to reserve this plan to the last, and meanwhile to defend the camp and await developments. After a short interval, which barely gave time for making the dispositions and carrying out the arrangement which had been resolved upon, the enemy rushed down at a given signal from every side, and hurled stones and javelins on to the rampart. At first, while our men were still fresh, they resisted stoutly, not a missile which they threw from their commanding position missing its mark, and when any part of the camp that was inadequately manned appeared to be hard pressed, men hurried to the rescue. But what told against them was that when the enemy were exhausted by prolonged fighting, they went out of action and fresh men took their places, while our men, owing to their slender numbers, could not follow their example. And not only was it impossible for a man to go out of action when he was tired, but even if wounded he could not leave his post and recover himself. For more than 6 hours the fighting had been incessant. Not only the strength of our men, but even their missiles were failing. The enemy were pressing on with increased energy, and as our men grew feebler, they began to fill up the trenches and demolish the rampart. In this extremity Publius Sextius Baculus, the chief centurion who, as we have said, had received several severe wounds in the battle with the Nervii, ran to Galba, accompanied by Gaius Vilicinus, a tribune of great judgment and courage, and pointed out that the only chance of safety was to try a forlorn hope and make a sortie. Galba therefore summoned the centurions, and quickly made the men understand that they were to leave off fighting for a little, only parrying the enemy's missiles, rest after their exertions, and afterwards, when the signal was given, charge out of the camp and trust for safety to sheer courage. The order was carried out. Suddenly they charged out of all the gates, and never gave the enemy a chance of divining their intention or closing the ranks. Fortune had changed sides. The assailants, who had actually hoped to take the camp, were surrounded and slain. More than a third of the entire native force that had assailed the camp, which was known to number over 30,000 men, were killed. The rest were sent flying in panic, and the Romans would not suffer them to rally even on the heights. Having thus routed the entire hostile force and taken their arms, they returned to their entrenchments. After fighting this battle, Galba had no wish to tempt fortune any more. He reflected that the circumstances with which he had to contend were at variance with the purpose for which he had taken up his quarters, and the scarcity of corn and other supplies caused him great anxiety. Next day, therefore, he fired all the buildings in the village and hastened to return to the province. And, as no enemy attempted to stop him or oppose his march, he brought the legion back safely into the country of the Nantuates, and thence to that of the Allobroges, where he passed the winter. After these operations everything led Caesar to believe that Gaul was tranquillized, for the Belgae were overpowered, the Germans driven out, and the Sidoni defeated in the Alps. Accordingly, he had started at the beginning of winter for Illyricum, being anxious to visit the tribes there as well as those of Gaul, and to make himself acquainted with their country, when suddenly war broke out in Gaul for the following reason. The younger Publius Crassus, who was wintering with the 7th legion among the Andes near the ocean, finding that corn was scarce in the district, sent a number of auxiliary officers and tribunes to the neighbouring tribes to arrange for a supply. Amongst others, Titus Tarasidius was sent to the Suevi, Marcus Trebius Gallus to the Coriasolites, and Quintus Valenius, conjointly with Titus Celius, to the Veneti. The last named tribe is by far the most influential of all the maritime peoples in that part of the country. They possess numerous ships in which they regularly sail to Britain. They excel the other peoples in knowledge of navigation and seamanship, and, the sea being very stormy and open, with only a few scattered harbours which they keep under their control, they compel almost all who sail those waters to pay toll. They took the initiative by detaining Celius and Valenius, believing that they would be able to use them to get back the hostages whom they had given to Crassus. Their neighbours, influenced by their example, and making up their minds like true Gauls suddenly and without consideration, detained Trebius and Tarasidius for the same reason, hurriedly dispatched envoys, and through the medium of their leaders pledged themselves to do nothing without official sanction, and to stand by one another in victory or defeat, and called upon the other tribes to resolve to hold fast to the liberty which they had received from their forefathers, and not to submit to the yoke of the Romans. They speedily gained over all the maritime tribes, and jointly sent an embassy to Publius Crassus, calling upon him, if he wished to recover his officers, to restore their hostages. When Caesar was informed of these events by Crassus, he was a long way off, and accordingly gave orders that ships of war should be built before his return on the Loire, which flows into the ocean, oarsmen raised from the province, and seamen and pilots assembled. These orders were promptly executed, and as soon as the season permitted he hastened to join the army. On hearing of his approach, the Veneti, and also the other tribes, being aware that they had committed a heinous offence in detaining and imprisoning envoys, whose office had always, among all peoples, been held sacred and inviolable, proceeded to make preparations for war, and especially to provide for the equipment of their ships, on a scale commensurate with the magnitude of the danger. And they worked with a hopefulness which was increased by their faith in the natural strength of their country. They knew that the roads were interrupted by estuaries, and that navigation was rendered difficult by the want of topographical information and the scarcity of harbours. They were confident that our armies would not be able to remain long in their country, for want of grain, and even if all their calculations were upset, they had command of the sea, while the Romans were ill supplied with ships and had no knowledge of the theatre of the approaching war, the shoals, harbours, and islands. Finally, they saw that navigation in a landlocked sea and in the open, boundless ocean were very different things. After forming their plans, they fortified their strongholds, stored them with grain from the country districts, and assembled as many ships as possible in Venetia, where it was known that Caesar would open the campaign. They secured the alliance of the Osimi, Lexovi, Nimnetes, Ambiliatae, Morini, Diablintes, and Menapii, and sent for reinforcements to Britain, which faces that part of Gaul. The difficulties above mentioned which beset the campaign were serious, but nevertheless Caesar had many urgent motives for undertaking it. The violation of international law in detaining Roman knights, the fact that the tribes after submission had renewed hostilities and revolted although they had given hostages, the wide extension of the conspiracy, and, above all, the danger that, if this district were left unpunished, the other peoples would fancy that they might offend in the same way. Knowing therefore that the Gauls were almost all politically restless, and that their warlike passions were easily and swiftly roused, and moreover that all men are naturally fond of freedom and hate to be in subjection, he thought it best, before more tribes had time to join the movement, to break up his army and distribute it over a wider area. Accordingly, he sent Titus Labienus with a body of cavalry into the country of the Treveri, near the Rhine, with orders to visit Remi and the other Belgic peoples and keep them obedient, and in case the Germans, whose assistance was said to have been solicited by the Belgae, attempted to force a passage in boats across the river, to stop them. Publius Crassus was directed to march with 12 legionary cohorts and a strong body of cavalry for Aquitania, in order to prevent the dispatch of reinforcements to Gaul from the peoples of that country and the junction of two powerful races. Quintus Titurius Sabinus, one of the generals, was sent with 3 legions into the country of the Venelli, Coriosolites, and Lexovi, to keep that section of the rebels isolated. The younger Decimus Brutus was placed in command of the fleet and of the Gallic ships which Caesar had ordered to assemble from the ports of the Pictones and Centoni and from the other settled districts, with orders to sail, as soon as possible, for the country of the Veneti. Caesar marched thither in person with the land forces. The strongholds were generally so situated on the ends of spits or headlands that it was impossible to approach them on foot when the tide came rushing in from the open sea, which regularly happens every 12 hours, or to sail up to them, because at the ebb the ships would have been injured in the shallow water. Both of these causes interfered with the siege of the strongholds. The besiegers kept out the sea by building dikes, and by this means got on a level with the walls of the town. But when the besieged, overmatched by the magnitude of the works, began to lose confidence, they brought up a large number of ships, of which they had an unlimited supply, removed all their property, and withdrew to the nearest strongholds, where they again defended themselves by the same advantages of position. These tactics they found it easy to keep up during a great part of the summer, because our ships were detained by stormy weather, and navigation was very difficult in a vast open sea, where the tides were strong and harbours few and far between. Indeed, practically non-existent. Their own ships were built and fitted out in the following way. They were a good deal more flat-bottomed than ours, to adapt them to the conditions of shallow water and ebbing tides. Bows and sterns alike were very lofty, being thus enabled to resist heavy seas and severe gales. The hulls were built throughout of oak, in order to stand any amount of violence and rough usage. The cross timbers, consisting of beams a foot thick, were riveted with iron bolts as thick as a man's thumb. The anchors were secured with iron chains instead of ropes. Hides or leathers dressed fine were used instead of sails, either because flax was scarce and the natives did not know how to manufacture it, or, more probably, because they thought it difficult to make head against the violent storms and squalls of the ocean, and to manage vessels of such burthen with ordinary sails. When these ships encountered our fleet, the latter had the advantage only in speed and in being propelled by oars. In other respects the former, from their more suitable construction, were better adapted to the conditions of the coast and the force of the storms. They were so solidly built that our ships could not injure them by ramming. Owing to their height, it was not easy to throw javelins onto them, and for the same reason it was difficult to seize them with grappling irons. Moreover, when it began to blow hard and they were running before the wind, they could weather the storm more easily, they could lie up more safely in shallow water, and when they were left aground by the ebb, they had nothing to fear from a stony bottom and sharp rocks, whereas our ships were in great danger from all of these contingencies. After taking several strongholds, Caesar saw that all his labour was being expended in vain, and that, by merely capturing their forts, he could neither prevent the enemy from escaping nor cripple them. He decided, therefore, that it would be best to wait for his fleet. As soon as it arrived and was sighted by the enemy, their ships, numbering about 220 ready for sea and fully equipped, stood out of harbour and ranged opposite ours. Brutus, who commanded the fleet, and the tribunes and centurions, each of whom had been entrusted with a single ship, did not quite know what to do, or what tactics to adopt. They had ascertained that it was impossible to injure the enemy's ships by ramming. The turrets were run up, but even then they were overtopped by the foreigners' lofty sterns, so that, from the lower position, it was impossible to throw javelins with effect, while the missiles thrown by the Gauls fell with increased momentum. Our men, however, had a very effective contrivance ready, namely hooks, sharpened at the end and fixed to long poles shaped somewhat like grappling hooks. By means of these the halyards were seized and pulled taut, the galley rowed hard, and the ropes snapped. When they were cut, the yards of course fell down, and as the efficiency of the Gallic ships depended altogether upon their sails and rigging, when they were gone the ships were no longer of any use. Thenceforward the struggle turned upon sheer courage, in which our soldiers easily had the advantage, especially as the fighting went on under the eyes of Caesar and the whole army, so that no act of courage at all remarkable could escape notice, for all the cliffs and high ground which commanded a near view over the sea were occupied by the army. When, as we have said, the yards tumbled down, the Roman ships 2 or 3 at a time closed round one of the enemies, and the legionaries clambered aboard with the utmost vigour. Several ships had been captured, when the natives, seeing what was happening and realizing that there was no help for it, hastened to save themselves by flight. And now, just as the ships had been put before the wind, there was suddenly a dead calm, and they could not stir. This was just what was wanted to make the victory complete. Our men gave chase and captured the ships one after another, with the result that, after a battle lasting from about the 4th hour till sunset, only a very few of the whole armada managed, when the night stopped the pursuit, to make the land. This battle brought the war with the Veneti and all the coast tribes to an end, for all the fighting men, and indeed all the seniors of any standing or whose counsels had any weight, had taken part in it. They had brought every one of their ships into action, and now that they were lost, the survivors had no place to escape to and no means of defending their strongholds. They surrendered, therefore, to Caesar unreservedly. He determined to inflict upon them a signal punishment, in order to make the natives respect the rights of ambassadors more carefully in the future. Accordingly, he put to death the entire council, and sold the rest of the population into slavery. End of chapters 1 through 16. Recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Becky Cook. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar. Translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book 3, Chapters 17 through 29. While these events were passing in the country of the Veneti, Quintus Titurius Sabinus made his way with the troops assigned to him by Caesar into the country of the Venelli. Their leader was Viridovix, who was also commander-in-chief of all the insurgent tribes, and had raised from them an army and large irregular levies. Within the few days that followed Sabinus's arrival, the Alerci Eborovices and the Lexovii massacred their senators because they refused to sanction the war, shut their gates, and joined Viridovix. And a host of desperadoes and brigands had also assembled from all parts of Gaul, to whom the hope of plunder and love of fighting were more attractive than farming and regular work. Sabinus, who occupied a position in all respects excellent, remained obstinately in camp, while Viridovix, who had encamped opposite him 2 miles off, led out his troops every day and offered battle. The result was that Sabinus not only incurred the contempt of the enemy, but was actually the object of some abuse from his own troops, and he let the enemy become so convinced of his timidity that they presently ventured to approach close to the rampart. His motive was that he felt bound, as a subordinate, especially in the absence of his chief, to avoid engaging such a numerous enemy unless he had the best of ground or some favourable opportunity presented itself. Now that they were convinced of his timidity, he selected from his auxiliaries a quick-witted Gaul, the very man for his purpose, induced him by liberal rewards and promises to go over to the enemy, and explained his object. The man came to them in the guise of a deserter, described the terror of the Romans, and explained that Caesar himself was hard pressed by the Veneti, and that Sabinus would march his army stealthily out of camp not later than the following night and go to his assistance. On hearing this, they all cried out that the chance of striking a decisive blow was not to be lost. They must attack the camp. Many circumstances combined to impel them to this decision. The recent inaction of Sabinus, the assurances of the deserter, want of supplies, for which they had made scant provision, the hope that the Veneti would succeed in their campaign, and lastly, the fact that what men desire they are generally prone to believe. Influenced by these motives, they would not suffer Viridovix and the other leaders to leave the assembly until they had agreed to let them arm and make a dash for the camp. When they were allowed to have their way, they were as exultant as if victory were certain, and, collecting brushwood and faggots to fill up the Roman trenches, they advanced against the camp. The camp stood on rising ground, which sloped gently from its base for about a mile. The Gauls hurried up at a great pace in order to give the Romans the least possible time for falling into line and arming, and arrived breathless. Sabinus harangued his men, and gave the signal which they were eagerly awaiting. As the enemy were hampered by their loads, he ordered a sudden sortie from 2 of the gates. Thanks to the favourable position, the courage of the legionaries, and the experience which they had gained in previous combats, and their own want of skill and exhaustion, the enemy instantly turned tail without standing a single charge from our men. They were in no condition to escape, and our troops, who were fresh for our pursuit, killed a great number of them. The rest were hunted down by the cavalry, who allowed few to get away. Thus Sabinus heard of the sea fight and Caesar of Sabinus's victory at the same time, and all the tribes immediately submitted to Titurius. For, while the Gallic temperament is impetuous and warlike, their character is irresolute and has little power of bearing up against a disaster. About the same time Crassus arrived in Aquitania, which, as the narrative has shown, may be regarded in Aryan population as 1/3 of Gaul. Knowing that he had to fight in a country where, a few years before, a Roman general, Lucius Valerius Praeconinus, had been killed and his army defeated, and from which a proconsul, Lucius Manlius, had retreated in disorder with the loss of his baggage, he saw that he would have to exercise no ordinary care. Accordingly, he provided for a supply of grain, raised auxiliaries and cavalry, and also called out individually a large number of excellent soldiers from Tolosa, Carcasso, and Narbo, states in the province adjacent to Aquitania, and marched his army into the country of the Sociates. On becoming aware of his approach, raised a large force, including cavalry, being very strong in that arm, and attacked our column on its march. The battle began with a combat of horse. Their cavalry were repulsed, and ours were pursuing them, when suddenly they unmasked their infantry, which they had stationed in ambush in a valley. The latter fell upon our disordered troops and renewed the action. The fighting was prolonged and fierce, for the Sociates relied upon their past victories, and felt that the fate of all Aquitania depended upon their courage, while our men were eager that the world should see what they could achieve under their youthful leader, without the chief and the other legions. At length the enemy, having suffered heavy loss, turned and fled. Many of them were slain, and Crassus, advancing to the chief town of the Sociates, at once proceeded to lay siege to it. As the garrison offered a stout resistance, he brought up sheds and towers. The garrison first attempted a sortie, then drove galleries in the direction of the terrace and sheds. The Aquitanians are very skilled in operations of this kind, as mining work exists in many parts of their country. But finding that, owing to the vigilance of our troops, they could effect nothing by these devices, they sent envoys to Crassus asking him to accept their surrender. The request was granted, and, in obedience to his command, they laid down their arms. But all was not over. Our men were all intently watching what was going on, when Adiatunus, who was in command, attempted a sortie from another part of the town with 600 devoted followers, whom the natives called Soldurii, men who, while life lasts, share all good things with the friends to whom they have attached themselves, on the understanding that, if any violence befall them, they are either to share their fate or to die by their own hands. And within the memory of man no one has ever been known to shrink from death when his friend and leader was slain. With these men Adiatunus attempted a sortie, but when the roar of battle arose from that part of the entrenchment, the soldiers ran to arms, and, after hard fighting, Adiatunus was driven back into the town. Notwithstanding, he prevailed upon Crassus to allow him to surrender on the original terms. On receiving the arms and hostages, Crassus started for the country of the Vocates and the Taurusates. And now, learning that a fortified town of great natural strength had been captured a few days after the arrival of the besiegers, the natives were thoroughly alarmed and began to send envoys in all directions, to swear mutual fidelity, to exchange hostages, and to raise troops. Envoys were also sent to the tribes of Hither Spain, near Aquitania, with a request for reinforcements and leaders, whose arrival enabled them to undertake the campaign with great prestige and to put a large number of men in the field. The leaders chosen had served from first to last with Quintus Sertorius, and were believed to possess great military skill. Adopting Roman methods, they proceeded to select positions, to entrench their camp, and to cut off our convoys. Crassus, reflecting that his own force was too small to be readily divided, that the enemy, while scouring the country and blocking the roads, were able to leave a sufficient force to protect their camp, which made it difficult to bring up corn and other supplies, and that their numbers were daily increasing, thought it best to fight a decisive battle without delay. He referred the question to a council of war, and, finding that everyone agreed with him, determined to fight on the morrow. At daybreak he moved out the whole force, formed them into 2 lines with auxiliaries in the center, and awaited the development of the enemy's plans. Although relying on their numbers, their established military reputation, and the weakness of our force, they considered it safe to fight. They nevertheless thought it safer to gain a bloodless victory by blocking the roads and cutting off our supplies, while, in case the Romans began to retreat from want of food, their idea was to attack them on the march, when their movements were impeded and they had the packs to carry and were dispirited. The plan was approved by their leaders, and accordingly when the Roman army moved out they remained shut up in camp. Crassus divined their intention. Their inaction, which produced the belief that they were cowed, had stimulated the ardor of our troops for battle, and all were overheard saying that the camp ought to be attacked without further delay. So Crassus, haranguing his men, who were all in great heart, advanced rapidly against the enemy's camp. Some filled up the trenches, others drove the defenders from the rampart and fortification with volleys of missiles, and the auxiliaries, in whose soldierly qualities Crassus had not much faith, kept the combatants supplied with stones and other missiles, brought up sods for filling the trench, and thus made a decent show of fighting. The enemy, too, fought steadily and with no lack of courage, and the missiles which they threw from their commanding position did good execution. Meanwhile, some troopers rode round the enemy's camp and reported to Crassus that on the side of the rear gate it was not entrenched so carefully as elsewhere and offered easy entrance. Crassus urged his cavalry officers to stimulate their men by liberal rewards and promises, and explained his object. In obedience to orders, they marched out the cohorts which had been left to protect the camp and had had nothing to tire them, made a wide detour to avoid being observed from the enemy's camp, and, while everybody was intent upon the action and noticed nothing else, rapidly gained the part of the entrenchments which we have mentioned, demolished them, and made good their footing in the camp before the enemy could clearly see them or make out what was going on. And now, when our troops heard the shouting from that part of the camp, their strength returned, as generally happens when soldiers feel confident of victory, and they fought with redoubled energy. Finding themselves surrounded, the enemy in utter despair hastened to throw themselves over the entrenchments and ran for their lives. The cavalry hunted them over the broad, open plains. Out of 50,000 who were known to have come from Aquitania and the land of Cantabari, barely a fourth escaped them, and late at night they returned to camp. On hearing the result of the battle, the bulk of the population of Aquitania, including the Tarbelli, Begiriones, Petitiani, Vocates, Taurosates, Elusates, Gates, Asci, Garumni, Sibusates, and Cocosates, submitted to Crassus and voluntarily sent hostages. A few distant tribes trusted to the lateness of the season, as winter was coming on, and neglected to follow their example. About the same time Caesar led his army against the Morini and the Menapii, in the belief that the campaign could soon be finished. The summer was nearly over, but while all the rest of Gaul was tranquilized, they remained in arms, and had never sent envoys to him to sue for peace. Their tactics were quite different from those of the other Gauls. Being aware that the strongest tribes which had fought in the open field had been completely defeated, they took refuge, with all their belongings, in their continuous forests and marshes. On reaching the outskirts of the forest, Caesar proceeded to entrench his camp. No enemy had so far appeared, and the men were working in scattered groups, when suddenly the enemy rushed out from the forest from all sides and attacked them. The men quickly seized their weapons and drove them back into the forest with considerable loss, but pursuing them too far, over very difficult ground, lost a few of their own number. Caesar now proceeded to clear the forest, and continued doing so day after day. To prevent the soldiers from being attacked in flank, while they were unarmed and off their guard, he regularly laid the timber as it was felled in the direction of the enemy, and piled it as a barricade on both flanks. A large space was cleared with incredible speed in a few days, by which time the enemy's cattle and the rear portion of their baggage were in our hands, while they were making for the denser parts of the forest. But such stormy weather followed that the work had to be discontinued, and, owing to continuous rains, it was impossible to keep the soldiers longer under tents. Accordingly, after ravaging all the enemy's fields and burning their hamlets and homesteads, Caesar withdrew his troops and quartered them for the winter in the territories of the Alarci, the Lexovi, and the other tribes which had recently been in arms. End of Book 3, Chapter 17-29. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar, translated by Thomas Rice Holmes.
War. chapters 1 to 15 of Commentaries on the Gallic War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ted Garvin. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar. Translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book 4, Chapter 1. The fate of the Usipetes and Tencteri, Caesar's first invasion of Britain. In the following winter, the year in which Gnaeus Pompeius and Marcus Crassus were consuls, a German tribe, the Usipetes, accompanied by the Tencteri, crossed the Rhine in large numbers, not far from the point where it enters the sea. Their motive was that for several years they had been subject to harassing attacks from the Suebi, and prevented from tilling the land. The Suebi are by far the most numerous and warlike of all the German peoples. They are said to comprise 100 clans, each of which annually sends 1,000 armed men on a military expedition beyond the frontier. The rest of the population remain at home and support the expeditionary force as well as themselves. Next year they take up arms in their turn, and the others remain at home. Thus agriculture goes on uninterruptedly, along with theoretical and practical training in war. Private property in land, however, does not exist, and no one is allowed to remain for farming in one spot longer than a year. Not much corn, indeed, is consumed. The people live principally on milk and flesh meat, and spend much time in hunting. This, combined with the nature of their food, their constant exercise and freedom from restraint, for they have never from childhood been made to obey or subjected to discipline, and never do anything against their inclination, fosters their bodily vigor and produces a race of gigantic stature. Moreover, they have trained themselves to wear no clothing, even in the coldest districts, except skins, which leave a large part of the body bare, and to bathe in the rivers. 2. Traders are allowed to enter their country, not because they want to import anything, but that they may find purchasers for their booty. Even horses, of which the Gauls are extremely fond, and to procure which they go to great expense, are not imported by the Germans. The native horses are undersized and ugly, but by constant exercise they develop in themselves extraordinary powers of endurance. In cavalry combats they often dismount and fight on foot, training their horses to stand still, and quickly remounting when necessary. According to their notions, nothing is more shameful or unmanly than the use of saddles, and so, however small their numbers, they are ready to encounter any number of cavalry who use them. They will not allow wine to be imported at all, considering that its use enfeebles a man's power of endurance, and makes him effeminate. 3. The communities as such pride themselves on keeping the land round their own borders uninhabited as far as possible, regarding it as a proof that many tribes are unable to cope with them. Thus it is said that on one side of the Sueban territory there is an uninhabited tract extending about 600 miles. On the opposite side their neighbors are the Ubi, who were once a considerable tribe, and according to German standards, a flourishing tribe. They are in fact rather more civilized than the rest of the nation, for they are near the Rhine. Their country is much frequented by traders, and from propinquity they have become familiarized with Gallic customs. The Suebi, after many campaigns and frequent attempts, had found them too numerous and powerful to be dispossessed, but they made them tributary and reduced them to comparative insignificance and weakness. 4. The Usipetes and Tencteri, mentioned above, were in the same position. For several years they withstood the pressure of the Suebi, but at length they were dispossessed, and after wandering for many years through many parts of Germany, came to the Rhine. The Menapi inhabited that region, and owned lands, homesteads, and villages on both sides of the river, but alarmed by the incursion of this large host, they abandoned their dwellings on the further bank, established outposts on this side of the Rhine, and determined to prevent the Germans from crossing. The latter tried every expedient, but being unable to force a passage from want of boats, or to get across unobserved because of the Menapian patrols, pretended to return to the district where they had settled, marched on for 3 days, and then turned back again. Their cavalry made the whole journey in a single night, and swooped down upon the Menapi, who, knowing nothing of their movements, were off their guard, and having been informed by their patrols that they had gone off, had fearlessly recrossed the Rhine and returned to their villages. The Germans slaughtered them, seized their boats, crossed the river before the Menapi on this side of the Rhine could tell what they were about, took possession of all their buildings, and for the rest of the winter lived on their stores. 5. The unstable character of the Gauls caused Caesar anxiety, for they do not abide by their decisions, and are generally prone to revolution. Accordingly, when he learned the facts, he thought it best not to rely upon them at all. It is a custom of theirs to detain travellers, even against their will, and question them individually about what they have heard or ascertained on this or that topic. And in the towns the people cluster around traders, and make them say where they come from, and tell them the news. Influenced by these reports, even when they are merely hearsay, they often embark upon the most momentous enterprises, and as they trust blindly to vague gossip, and their informants generally tell lies and frame their answers to please them, they naturally repent of their plans as soon as they are formed. 6. Caesar was aware of this custom, and to avoid having a serious war on his hands, he started to rejoin his army earlier than usual. On his arrival he found that his forebodings were justified. Embassies had been sent by more than one tribe to the Germans, inviting them to quit the neighbourhood of the Rhine, and promising to supply all their requirements. Allured by this prospect, they were now wandering further afield, and had reached the territories of the Eburones and Condrusi, both dependents of the Treveri. Caesar summoned the Gallic notables, and thinking it well to dissemble what he knew, addressed them in soothing and reassuring terms, directed them to furnish cavalry, and announced his intention of taking the field against the Germans. 7. After arranging for a supply of grain, and selecting troopers from the several contingents, he began his march towards the districts in which he heard that the Germans were encamped. When he was within a few days' march from them, their envoys arrived, and addressed him as follows. The Germans were not the aggressors, but if they were provoked they would not shrink from a contest with the Roman people, for it was a principle of theirs, handed down by their forefathers, to resist all who attacked them, and not to sue for mercy. Still this much they would say, they had come reluctantly because they had been driven from their country. If the Romans cared for their goodwill, their friendship might be of use to them. Let the Romans either assign them lands, or suffer them to retain those which they had won by the sword. They acknowledged the superiority of the Suebi alone, for even the immortal gods were no match for them, and there was no other people upon earth whom they could not overcome. 8. Caesar made a suitable reply. The upshot of his speech was that there could be no friendship between him and the Germans if they remained in Gaul. It was not reasonable for people who could not defend their own territories to take possession of those of others, and besides, there were no unoccupied lands in Gaul which could be made over to any people, least of all to one so numerous, without injustice. Still, they might settle, if they wished, in the country of the Ubi, whose envoys were with him, complaining of the ill treatment of the Suebi, and asking for his aid, and he would order the Ubi to receive them. 9. The envoys said that they would refer this offer to their principals, and after it had been considered, would return to Caesar in 3 days. Meanwhile they requested him not to move nearer. Caesar told them that it was impossible for him to make even this concession. He had ascertained that a large detachment of their cavalry had been sent across the Meuse some days before to the country of the Ambiviarti, to plunder and forage, and he believed that they were waiting for their return, and that was their motive for trying to gain time. 10. The Meuse rises in the Vosges mountains, which are in the territory of the Lingones, receives an affluent called the Wall from the Rhine, thereby forming the island of the Batavi, and not more than 80 miles from that point flows into the ocean. The Rhine rises in the country of the Leponti, who inhabit the Alps, and flows swiftly for a long distance through the territories of the Nantuetes, Helvetii, Sequani, Mediomatrici, Trebosi, and Treveri. As it approaches the sea, it branches off into several channels, and forms numerous large islands, many of which are inhabited by fierce, rude tribes, some of whom are supposed to live on fish and birds' eggs, and discharges itself by numerous outlets into the ocean. 11. When Caesar was not more than 12 miles from the enemy, their envoys returned to him according to agreement, and meeting him on his march, earnestly entreated him to advance no farther. As they could not induce him to comply, they begged him to send word to the cavalry which had gone on in advance of the column, forbidding them to fight, and to let them send envoys to the Ubi, declaring that if their council and chiefs swore to keep faith with them, they would avail themselves of the terms which he offered, and asking him to give them 3 days to complete the arrangements. Caesar believed that all these stipulations had the same object, to secure 3 days' delay for the return of the absent cavalry. Still, he said that he would advance 4 miles and no more that day, to get water. On the morrow as many of them as could come were to assemble at his halting place, that he might take cognizance of their request. Meanwhile, he sent messengers to tell the cavalry officers, who had gone on in front of their whole force, not to attack the enemy, and in case they were attacked themselves, to remain on the defensive till he came up with the rest of the army. 12. Our cavalry, who numbered 5,000, felt no anxiety, as the German envoys had asked for an armistice for that day, and he had only just left Caesar. The moment the enemy caught sight of them, although they had not more than 800 horse, those who had crossed the Meuse to forage not having yet returned, they charged and speedily threw them into confusion, and when they rallied, the enemy, following their regular practice, sprang to the ground, stabbed their horses in the belly, and unhorsed a number of our men. They charged and speedily threw them into confusion, and when they rallied, the enemy, following their regular practice, sprang to the ground, stabbed the horses in the belly, and unhorsed a number of our men, sent the rest flying, and swept them along in such panic that they never drew rein till they came in sight of our column. 74 of our troopers were killed in the affair, including Piso, a gallant Aquitanian of the most illustrious family, whose grandfather had been honored by the Senate with the title of friend, and had held sovereignty in his own tribe. His brother was surrounded by the enemy, but he went to his assistance and rescued him, and though his horse was wounded and he was thrown, he resisted most gallantly as long as he could. Surrounded and covered with wounds, he fell, when his brother, who had by this time got away from the press and was some distance off, saw what had happened, and putting spurs to his horse, rode straight against the enemy and perished. 13. After this combat, Caesar no longer felt bound to listen to the envoys, or to entertain the proposals of a people who, after asking for peace, had made a treacherous, insidious, and unprovoked attack. On the other hand, he thought that it would be the height of folly to wait till the enemy were reinforced by the return of their cavalry. From his knowledge of the unstable character of the Gauls, he realized that the enemy, by a single victory, had already gained great prestige with them, and he thought it best to give them no time to form their plans. Having come to this decision, he communicated to his quaestor and generals his determination not to lose a day in forcing on a battle, when a most fortunate event occurred. Next day, early in the morning, a numerous deputation of the Germans, comprising all the leading men and all those of mature age, came to the camp, in the same spirit of treachery and deceit, to wait upon him. Their ostensible object was to clear themselves from complicity in the attack which had taken place the day before, contrary to the agreement which they had themselves asked for. At the same time they intended, if possible, to gain an extension of the armistice on some pretext. Caesar was delighted that they had put themselves in his power, and ordered them to be detained. He then marched out of camp at the head of his whole force, ordering the cavalry, whom he believed to be demoralized by the recent combat, to bring up the rear. 14. Forming the army in 3 lines, he made a rapid march of 8 miles, and reached the enemy's camp before the Germans could realize what was going to happen. The rapidity of our advance and the absence of their leaders suddenly and completely unnerved them. There was no time to consider or to arm, and they were too distracted to know whether it was best to throw their strength against the enemy, to defend the camp, or to fly for their lives. Their terror was manifested by cries and hurried movements, and the soldiers, exasperated by the treachery of the previous day, burst into the camp. Those who were quick enough to seize their weapons made a brief stand there against our men, fighting under cover of their wagons and baggage. But the host of women and children, for they had left their country and crossed the Rhine with all their belongings, began to flee in all directions, and Caesar sent his cavalry to hunt them down. 15. The Germans heard the shrieks behind, and seeing that their kith and kin were being slaughtered, threw away their weapons, abandoned their standards, and rushed out of the camp. When they reached the confluence of the Moselle and the Rhine, great numbers were already killed, and the rest, giving up all hope of escape, plunged into the stream and there perished, overcome by terror, weariness, and the force of the current. Our men had anxiously anticipated an arduous struggle, for the enemy's numbers had amounted to 430,000, but all to a man returned safe to camp with only a very few wounded. Caesar gave the prisoners whom he had detained in camp the option of going free, but as they were afraid of being punished and tortured by the Gauls whose lands they had ravaged, they said that they would prefer to remain with him, and he permitted them to do so. End of chapter 15.